Yusuf Karim stepped inside Sheikh Khalid al-Rahman's villa that night, but by morning, he was dead, and a carefully hidden secret began to unravel. Sheikh Khalid al-Rahman had built a life that appeared flawless from the outside. His name carried weight in Dubai's elite circles, and his presence alone commanded respect. Years of calculated business decisions had earned him immense wealth, allowing him to live in one of the city's most private and luxurious residential communities. His villa stood behind high walls, protected by advanced security systems and carefully selected staff who followed strict routines. Everything about his environment was designed to maintain control. For years, that control had never been questioned. His daily life followed a predictable structure. Early mornings were reserved for business matters, followed by private meetings and limited social appearances. He rarely attended public events unless necessary, preferring to keep his interactions contained within trusted circles. Even within the neighborhood, his presence was distant. He acknowledged others politely but never allowed familiarity to develop. That distance was part of his image. Residents viewed him as disciplined, reserved, and untouchable. There were no visible cracks in the life he had built. Nothing suggested that anything unusual existed behind the walls of his property. The security surrounding his home reinforced that perception, creating a clear boundary between his private world and everything outside it. Then small changes began to appear. At first, they were easy to ignore. His routine shifted slightly, with irregular hours replacing his usual schedule. Lights in certain areas of the villa remained on late into the night, something that had not been typical before. Staff movements also changed. Some longtime employees were no longer seen, replaced by a smaller and more discreet team. The atmosphere around the property became quieter, more controlled. Neighbors noticed these changes but did not question them openly. In a community where privacy was valued above all else, curiosity rarely turned into action. Still, the pattern did not go completely unnoticed. Around the same time, Yusuf Karim began appearing more frequently. He lived just a few houses away with his family, known in the neighborhood as a quiet and respectful young man. His presence near Sheikh Khalid's villa stood out, not because it was dramatic, but because it was unusual. He was seen walking near the property at different times of the day, sometimes lingering longer than expected. There was no clear reason for it. The interactions, if they existed, were not visible. No one saw him enter the villa, and no direct connection was ever confirmed. Yet the timing of his appearances aligned too closely with the changes in Sheikh Khalid's routine to be dismissed entirely. Weeks passed, and the pattern continued. Yusuf's movements remained subtle, but consistent. Sheikh Khalid's behavior became increasingly withdrawn. The villa, once simply private, now felt isolated. The difference was not dramatic enough to draw attention from outside the community, but within it, the shift was clear to those who observed closely. Then came the night that changed everything. The quiet routine of the neighborhood was broken by the sudden arrival of emergency vehicles. Their presence was controlled but urgent, moving directly toward Sheikh Khalid's villa. Security around the property intensified immediately, limiting visibility and access. By morning, the news had spread. Yusuf Karim had been found dead inside the Sheikh's home. The controlled world that had existed behind those walls was no longer hidden. The discovery of Yusuf Karim's body inside Sheikh Khalid al-Rahman's villa transformed a quiet, private neighborhood into the center of a controlled but intense investigation. Authorities moved quickly, sealing off the property and restricting access to anyone not directly involved. The response was precise and organized, reflecting the seriousness of the situation and the influence surrounding it. From the beginning, the case presented contradictions. Yusuf had been found inside a highly secured residence, a place designed to prevent unauthorized entry. The villa's surveillance system covered every access point, and security protocols were known to be strict. Yet there were no immediate signs of forced entry. Doors and windows were intact, and there was no evidence suggesting that Yusuf had broken in. This detail shifted the focus immediately. If he had not forced his way inside, then he had either been allowed in or entered under circumstances that had been deliberately concealed. Investigators began analyzing the villa's security data, expecting to find a clear record of his movements. What they found instead raised more questions. Critical segments of surveillance footage were missing. The gaps were not random or caused by technical failure. They occurred during a specific window of time, aligning closely with the estimated period of Yusuf's death. The system itself showed signs of manual interference, suggesting that someone with authorized access had altered or removed the recordings. The absence of footage became one of the most important pieces of evidence. It indicated intent. Investigators expanded their analysis to include system access logs. Every interaction with the surveillance network was recorded, even if the footage itself had been erased. These logs revealed that the system had been accessed multiple times during the missing time frame, using credentials that traced back to the villa's internal control. This narrowed the scope significantly. Only a limited number of individuals had the authority to access and modify the system at that level. At the center of that control was Sheikh Khalid himself. His role in the investigation became unavoidable. Despite this, his behavior remained composed. He cooperated within limits, providing general information about his routine but offering no clear explanation for Yusuf's presence inside the villa. His statements aligned with certain aspects of the timeline but failed to address the missing footage or the access logs. The investigation moved deeper. Forensic teams examined the scene in detail, looking for physical evidence that could clarify what had happened. The layout of the room, the positioning of objects, and the condition of the environment suggested that Yusuf had not been there for long before the incident occurred. There were no signs of prolonged activity, indicating that whatever happened had unfolded quickly. At the same time, inconsistencies began to emerge. The estimated time of death did not fully match the remaining surveillance data. There were gaps that could not be explained without considering the missing footage. These gaps became central to reconstructing the sequence of events. Outside the villa, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted. What had once been a place defined by privacy and distance was now filled with quiet speculation. Residents avoided direct discussion, but the presence of authorities and the visible changes around the Sheikh's property made it impossible to ignore what had happened. The case was no longer contained within the walls of a single home. It had begun to unravel a situation that extended beyond what anyone had initially assumed, with each new discovery pointing towards something that had been carefully hidden. As the investigation moved forward, attention shifted from the physical scene to the digital trail Yusuf Karim had left behind. His phone, recovered near the location where he was found, became one of the most important pieces of evidence. At first glance, it appeared ordinary. Messages, call logs, and applications showed nothing unusual. But a deeper forensic analysis revealed gaps, deleted conversations, missing timestamps, and traces of data that had been intentionally removed. Those gaps told a story. Specialists were able to partially recover fragments of the deleted data. Though incomplete, the recovered information showed a pattern of repeated communication with a single unknown contact. The messages had been exchanged over several weeks, often late at night, and followed no predictable schedule. The identity of the contact was hidden behind encrypted channels, making it difficult to trace directly. However, timing provided a clue. The communication logs aligned closely with the periods when Yusuf had been seen near Sheikh Khalid's villa. Each cluster of messages was followed by a sighting, suggesting coordination rather than coincidence. This pattern established that Yusuf's presence in the area had been planned in advance. Investigators then turned their focus toward Sheikh Khalid's digital environment. Access to his personal devices was restricted, but indirect data sources provided limited insight. External servers connected to the villa's network showed unusual activity during the same timeframes as Yusuf's communications. Encrypted connections had been established and terminated quickly, leaving behind only traces of their existence. These traces were enough. They suggested that communication had been taking place through channels designed to avoid detection. While the content of those exchanges remained unclear, the structure indicated careful planning and an awareness of how to conceal information. At the same time, forensic reports introduced another layer of complexity. The timeline of Yusuf's death, based on medical analysis, did not perfectly align with the available surveillance data. There was a window of time, small but significant, where events could not be accounted for. This missing period corresponded exactly with the gap in the surveillance footage. The absence of information became more important than what was visible. Investigators began reconstructing the timeline using indirect indicators. Power usage within the villa showed fluctuations during the missing hours. Certain systems had been activated briefly, suggesting movement within restricted areas. These details, while subtle, helped piece together a sequence of activity that had been deliberately hidden. The focus returned once again to access control. The security system logs confirmed that only authorized credentials had been used to override the surveillance during the critical time frame. There was no evidence of an external breach. This meant that whoever had altered the system was already inside the circle of trust. As more connections were established, the case shifted from uncertainty to structure. Yusuf's presence inside the villa was no longer unexplained. His movements had been guided through communication that had been concealed. The environment he entered had been controlled, and the absence of surveillance during key moments indicated deliberate action rather than coincidence. What remained unclear was what had happened within that missing window. But by now, the investigation had uncovered enough to understand one thing. The events of that night were not random. They were part of a sequence that had been carefully arranged, and then partially erased. Investigators now focused on the most critical gap in the case, the missing hours that had been erased from the villa's surveillance system. Without direct footage, they turned to indirect evidence, using every available data source to reconstruct what had taken place. The process was slow and technical, but it began to reveal a sequence that had been carefully hidden. The first breakthrough came from internal system logs. Even though the video recordings had been deleted, the infrastructure that supported the system had still recorded activity. Power fluctuations, sensor triggers, and automated responses provided fragments of information. These fragments showed that certain areas of the villa had been accessed during the missing time frame, despite no visible record of entry or movement. The pattern pointed toward deliberate control. The system had not failed. It had been adjusted. Investigators mapped out the villa's layout alongside the recorded data. By aligning the sensor activity with specific locations, they identified a path that had been used during the missing hours. This path led through restricted sections of the property, areas that were not part of normal guest access. This suggested that Yusuf had not been wandering through the villa. He had been guided or directed along a controlled route. Attention then shifted to environmental data. Temperature sensors within the villa recorded slight variations during the same time frame. These changes were small but consistent with the presence of multiple individuals in enclosed spaces. Combined with the movement patterns, this indicated that Yusuf had not been alone during those critical moments. The reconstruction continued. Access logs confirmed that the surveillance system had been overridden using internal credentials at the exact time the gaps began. The sequence of commands used to disable and later restore the system showed a level of familiarity with its operation. This was not an impulsive action. It had been planned and executed with precision. Financial records added another layer to the investigation. Recent transactions linked to Sheikh Khalid's accounts showed payments made to external individuals shortly before and after the incident. These payments did not match his usual financial activity. The timing suggested a connection to the events being investigated, though the exact purpose remained unclear. The possibility of additional involvement became stronger. The case was no longer centered solely on what had happened inside the villa. It began to extend outward, connecting to individuals and actions beyond the immediate scene. Each new piece of evidence suggested coordination rather than isolation. As investigators assembled the timeline, a clearer picture began to form. Yusuf had entered the villa through authorized means. His movement inside followed a specific path, one that had been mapped and controlled. The surveillance system had been disabled during the exact period when these movements occurred, preventing direct observation. Environmental data confirmed that others were present, though their identities remained unverified within the available evidence. The final moments of the timeline were the most difficult to reconstruct. The absence of direct footage left only indirect indicators, but those indicators pointed toward a sudden escalation. The controlled sequence of events appeared to have broken down, leading to an outcome that could not be reversed. The investigation had now reached a point where the hidden structure behind the case was visible. What remained was to determine responsibility within that structure, and to understand why it had been created in the first place. The final stage of the investigation brought together every fragment of evidence that had been uncovered. What had once appeared as a series of disconnected details, missing footage, altered logs, hidden communication, and unexplained financial activity, now formed a complete sequence. The picture that emerged was not simple, but it was clear enough to establish how events had unfolded. Yusuf Karim had not entered Sheikh Khalid Al-Rahman's villa by accident. The recovered digital traces confirmed that his visit had been arranged in advance through concealed communication channels. The timing of his arrival matched the gaps in the surveillance system, indicating that his entry had been coordinated with the temporary shutdown of monitoring. This level of planning showed that the environment had been prepared before he ever stepped inside. Once inside, his movement followed the controlled path investigators had reconstructed. Sensor data and system logs confirmed that he had been directed through restricted areas of the villa. The absence of visible resistance suggested that he had entered willingly, unaware of what would follow. The environment remained stable during the early part of this timeline, with no signs of disruption. Then something changed. The final portion of the reconstructed timeline showed a sudden shift in activity. Environmental data indicated rapid movement within a confined area, followed by a complete drop in recorded motion. This abrupt transition suggested that the situation had escalated quickly, breaking the controlled sequence that had been established. The missing surveillance footage covered this exact moment. While the visual record was gone, the surrounding data made it clear that this was when the critical event occurred. The absence of footage, combined with the system overrides, confirmed that this period had been deliberately concealed. Financial records provided the final connection. Payments made shortly after the incident were traced to individuals with access to technical systems and external services. These transactions suggested that steps had been taken to manage the aftermath, including the removal of data and the stabilization of the situation within the villa. The effort to contain the incident, however, had not been complete. Too many traces remained. Sheikh Khalid's role in the case became defined by control rather than direct visibility. As the primary authority over the property and its systems, he had the ability to authorize access, manage surveillance, and influence the environment in which the events took place. While the investigation could not fully reconstruct every second of the missing timeframe, the surrounding evidence placed him at the center of the sequence. The case moved toward its conclusion through legal proceedings supported by the accumulated evidence. The combination of digital records, forensic analysis, and financial data created a consistent narrative that could not be dismissed. Each piece reinforced the others, forming a structure that held even without the missing footage. For the community, the outcome reshaped everything. The neighborhood that had once been defined by privacy and distance was now marked by the realization that control and secrecy could hide far more than anyone expected. The image of stability that had surrounded Sheikh Khalid's life was replaced by a more complex and unsettling reality. In the end, the case revealed more than the events of a single night. It showed how carefully constructed environments can conceal actions until a single moment brings everything into the open. What had been hidden behind walls, systems, and reputation was no longer protected. The truth, once uncovered, remained permanent and impossible to erase.